my bandwidth for giving you the slides and the audio as best as we can do. And so I hear you in the background, Leroy, and your speaker's doing very well. So hello everybody, and I'm going to sign off my visual right now, and we'll get started with class. All right, so as you can see from your opening screen, Saturn is retrograde in Scorpio from March 2nd through July 20th of 2014. And this class is taking place live the day after March 3rd of 2014. And as always, we thank you for allowing us to do these few housekeeping slides at the beginning. This is what we offer in essence on our site, evolutionaryastrology.net. We have a free weekly podcast that is usually broadcast every Wednesday or Thursday, depending upon our work schedules. We also have our Astro Library, we have our multimedia course, and we have certification on our multimedia course. So here's the information on our Astro Library. We have 3 different sections. 1 is archetypes, planets, houses, signs. 2 is understanding the evolutionary astrology method for Pluto as representative of the soul. And 3 is everything else, relationship and family, astrology, forecasting, relocation, health, and wellness. And we currently have a special running on 6-month and 12-month subscriptions to either any of these 3 sections or all of them. And so right now you can have $10 off on the 6 or 12-month subscriptions by entering the coupon code Nebula. Correct, Leroy? And if I'm correct, you don't have to come in and say, but the coupon code is Nebula on checkout to have $10 off any of the 6 and 12-month subscriptions. Here's our multimedia course, the 3 different segments that we offer. And of course, you get a binder with a transcript, DVDs, access to 250 hours of audio files, and we have live webinar classes on segment 1 and segment 2 that I have started in January, very similar to what these classes are like. You have the visual, and then when it's over, you have the archived video and the PowerPoint slides that you can refer to and listen again and again. And so tonight's subject is the Saturn retrograde in Scorpio. I'm going to start right out by giving you some of the pertinent information, and that's going to be the points that you see in color. Now, I'll say something here. We can see that Saturn goes retrograde March 2nd through July 20th, from 2319 to 1639 Scorpio. However, if we look at the shadows of Saturn, I thought this was interesting. I've never really researched this. You know, when we work with Mercury, Venus, and Mars retrogrades, they move so many degrees through the zodiac that shadow time period before and after the actual retrograde time period, that's talked about a lot, it's observed a lot. And for reference, here we are, Saturn entering the shadow November 26th of 2013. That's when it was at 1639 Scorpio for the first time, which is where it's going to go stationary direct in July. So from November 26th to March 2nd, here's Saturn making that first passage from 16 to 23 Scorpio. Then we have the retrograde from March to July. Then Saturn is in its shadow again with the 3rd passage from July through October, traveling 16 to 23 degrees the last time. Now, what is so interesting for me is that when you look at Saturn and that shadow, those 3 times it's passing over those degrees of Scorpio, 16 to 23, that takes up 11 months of a year. And so I found that a little fascinating to think, wow, that is really Saturn concentrating on a certain degrees of the zodiac for quite a long period of time. And as a matter of fact, you can do this with the rest of the outer planets as well, and you're going to find it was giving me a whole new visual and understanding about this outer planet retrograde process, because the outer planets travel slower, so it takes them longer to go through certain degrees of the zodiac, or to go through a sign, or to go through a revolution around the zodiac. And it's like, wow, these outer planets really do concentrate over a few degrees for long periods of time. So stay tuned. For those of you who attend future workshops on the outer planets, I'll put that information up there for you. And of course, if you look at the blue, the highlight of any planetary retrograde cycle is its opposition or conjunction to the Sun. And with Saturn, this is going to come May 10th with the Sun at 20 Taurus, while Saturn is retrograde at 20 degrees Scorpio. Again, we'll return to this slide a little further along in this podcast, and you will have it as a PowerPoint PDF afterwards if you want to get all of these dates down for yourself. I also wanted to just give you this information, and I thank Leroy for reminding me of this at the last minute. This is why I was a few minutes late. I was like, oh my gosh, I never looked up Saturn's transit through Scorpio. Went into Scorpio October 5th of 2012. It is there until December 23rd, 2014. Its next retrograde is going to be in the midst of Sag and Scorpio. And then September 17th of 2015, it'll move into Sagittarius for the next two and a half years. So there's those dates for you if you really want to write them down quickly, as we're working with the Saturn and Scorpio theme of ours over the next hour or so. And so, moving along, some Saturn astronomy. Its revolution around the Sun is 29.46 years. Its revolution around the zodiac, which means going through all 12 signs of the zodiac, because of its retrograde cycle, can vary anywhere from 28 to 29 and a half years. Now, we've become very familiar with the Saturn return that happens in our late 20s for the first time. And as a matter of fact, many of us will have 2 or 3 Saturn returns. I have a slide for that for you in just a moment. But that Saturn return is something that we've become somewhat familiar with in astrology, and it is known loosely as when the soul actually becomes an adult. Saturn and its relationship to the maturation process. When you average it out, Saturn takes about 2.5 years to move through each sign of the zodiac. If you average out the daily mean motion, it only travels 2 minutes a day. And so, again, those outer planets that really start to slow down the passage because they're so far away from the Sun and planet Earth. Saturn has a retrograde cycle of once every calendar year. Its retrograde period is approximately 140 days, or just a little over 4 months. And its stationary period is 5 days. That means when it's slowing down to turn retrograde or direct, it will appear from planet Earth as though it is standing still in the sky for 5 days. Now, this is being recorded on March 3rd. Saturn went retrograde March 2nd. So Saturn has been standing still in 2014, February 28th, March 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. And this, when Saturn goes stationary retrograde, it also has a tendency to, well, all of the outer planets, it's pretty intense time periods. It's like everything is emphasized and squeezed between a rock and a hard spot, and whatever is needing to come to the surface is just blasting out. And with Saturn, it's going to be something about reality that's no longer working for us when it turns stationary retrograde. More Saturn astronomy. Saturn is the second largest planet in our solar system. It is a gas giant like Jupiter. However, I found this point to be fascinating. Saturn does not have very strong gravity. And this is due to the fact that it's one of the least, well, it is the least dense planet in our solar system. It's made up mostly of hydrogen and helium, which are the two lightest elements in the universe. So as we discover Saturn and how it relates to this space-time reality in this physical world, I just found it fascinating that it is the least dense planet in our solar system. It's a little fact for us that we can play with as we explore with Saturn. Now, Saturn is not perfectly round like most of the other planets in the solar system. Like Earth and Jupiter, it's wider on its equator, wider in the middle, and more narrow on its top and bottom. Saturn, Jupiter, Uranus, and Neptune all have rings around them. Many of you have seen those pictures of Saturn and its beautiful rings. It is a band of ice, dust, and rocks that's only a half a mile thick. Saturn has 7 categories of rings. And these rings are held in place by its moons. I did not know this. Saturn has 53 official moons and 9 more that have been found but have not been classified as moons yet that orbit around Saturn with its rings. You may have heard that Saturn's largest moon is Titan, the second largest moon in the solar system, larger than the moon on planet Earth. It's the gravity of all these moons going around Saturn that is causing the gaps in the rings and making it beautiful visual pictures for us. Now, just briefly, some mythology of Saturn. I am not the expert with mythology, but I thought I would put this little slide in for you. Historically, Saturn was known as the Roman god of agriculture. And if you will look at that picture very lightly behind this slide, you'll see the old man in scythe, I think it is, his thing that cuts the plants, cuts the grains, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. That's a common symbol for Saturn in history. Saturn was known as Cronus by the Greeks, and Saturn is the son of Uranus and the father of Jupiter. And I thought, oh, this is another fascinating thing that somebody with more mythology might know more details about. But isn't it interesting how we go Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and we have 3 generations of male figures. Now, the history is that Saturn, overthrew his father, Uranus, to become king of the gods, and then he was overthrown himself by his son Jupiter. Again, I don't know all the symbologies of that, but I put that out there for those of you who are interested in some of the essences. That we many of us know Saturn as that male figure and as Father Time. And we'll work more with that archetype here coming up. So this archetype of Saturn, as we start to delve into it, it is the passive polarity, which is energy moving back to the center. It's the cardinal modality, which is all about initiation, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And it is the element of Earth. So it's passive, cardinal, Earth. And when you're a beginner of astrology, or as you're moving along, if you will look at the polarities, modalities, and elements of each of the 12 archetypes, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, etc. We know Saturn as the ruler of Capricorn in the 10th house. When you look at polarities, modalities, and elements and break them down, they're very good at helping you learn the interpretation of the planet, the sign, the house, as it relates to one archetype. And so we know Saturn as Earth, the element Earth, and in evolutionary astrology, one of the most well-known phrases for Saturn is the structure of the individuated consciousness. In other words, Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, all the way out to Saturn. These are all planetary archetypes that are conscious within our mind, that are very easy for us to access and have an understanding of. Saturn is the boundaries of what's conscious. We go beyond Saturn, Chiron, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and we move into the unconsciousness, individually and collectively. So Saturn, as representative of the individuated consciousness, when you want to look for that in your chart, you will look for natal Saturn, the house it's in, the sign it's in, the aspects it makes to other planets. You'll look to see what sign, what house the sign Capricorn is ruling. Even if it's intercepted, it's not ruling, it's still going to be in a house. And you look for the sign of the zodiac that's on the cusp of the 10th house, which is the natural Saturn Capricorn house. And you look for that sign on the 10th house cusp with its planetary ruler by house sign aspects. Those are the three areas that you will put together to get an understanding of how any soul will have structured their consciousness in the current life. Now, all other planetary archetypes will be filtered and defined by Saturn. All of the inner planets will relate to Saturn, and Saturn will relate to the outer planets. Now, Saturn will attempt to suppress anything, and I could have Chiron in there too with Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Saturn will make an attempt to suppress anything that's coming up from the unconsciousness. And Saturn is not going to be successful at suppressing that. The outer planets will have the last word with Saturn, and they will be able to throw things up into the consciousness and force Saturn to relate to it, and they will force Saturn to refine some of its definitions of how it structures itself in space-time. So again, this is a slide that you could look at and ponder for your own chart for hours and hours and hours. In our segment 1 webinar classes, we will literally spend 2 hours on this slide as we move into working with all of our basic archetypes from a video webinar structure. So I don't make lightly of this slide, and I would invite all of you in your own self-studies to really look at this from the perspective of your own chart. And just look at Saturn by whatever house it's in and what sign it was in when you were born, and see how it structures you in a space-time manner. See how it structures you in your world. I have Saturn in Sagittarius, and so my structure of consciousness is very philosophical. My structure of consciousness is the teacher archetype. What I have to be careful of with Saturn in Sagittarius is that I'm not compensating on my own truth, because Sagittarius is an archetype that when it's not standing in its truth, it will compensate on itself. It will pretend to be something else. And as I've matured Saturn in my life, I've had to learn to stand up for my truth, Sagittarius, even when it didn't match up with another person, and even if it caused discomfort around somebody else. I used to be a lot more shy at speaking up and speaking out about my truth, especially over spiritual matters. And I have come to the point in my life, as I'm approaching my second Saturn return, where I might be gentle with my language with people. But anybody who wants to get into any type of discussion or debates with Kim Marie about spirituality, Sagittarius, my Saturn will kick in, and oh boy, I've gotten to the point where I can debate it pretty good. So that's just a little example for you. You're all going to have Saturn in the sign, Saturn in a house, and just reflect upon that to see how much effect that has and how everything in your life is orientated to that. And then you take it to all the other planets and how that relates to that. So Saturn, and when I say Saturn, this is also always true for Capricorn and the 10th house. It's an interchangeable archetype in EA. Saturn is that principle of conditioning. Conditioning by the family environment, by the social environment that we are born into. Social can be the culture, the country, the race. It is conditioned by our religious environment, and that many times comes through the family and the culture, and our resources environment. What type of economic conditioning we were born into. Now, I've kind of coined the term environmental conditionings to cover all of these things, and they are very important from the perspective of evolutionary astrology, because when you go to look at a planetary archetype in a certain sign or house, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Different evolutionary states of the soul will have different responses to an archetype, and our environmental conditionings will have a response to an archetype. And Saturn, it wants to be secure, especially in its outer world, the Earth environment. And that energy moving back to the center, the passive polarity, all of the passive polarities, which are going to be your even-numbered signs and houses, they all want a container or a boundary. They're all the earths, they're all the water and earth element signs and houses. And so they want to have that boundary that they can feel secure with. And by the time we get to the archetype of Capricorn in the 10th house, the 10th archetype, we're really wanting to build up that conditioning factor to feel secure in that outer world. Saturn is the maturation process relative to all of these environmental conditionings that come at us. And what happens with society, which is a Capricorn, Saturn, 10th house word, is society's got to have all its rules, all its norms and customs that allow us to function together as a group. You know, my little example is none of us would like driving if we didn't have traffic rules. If we didn't have red and green stoplights, it'd be pretty chaotic. So there is a healthy role for these conditioning factors in all of our lives. The distortions is when the conditioning comes at the expense of the individualization process of our soul. Uranus, and you can include Chiron, the archetypes that come after Saturn. What happens with the Saturn archetype is that we can get caught up in what we call standards of right, wrong conduct. And these standards are all going to be a reflection of the environmental conditionings of any soul and the environment that she was raised in. And if we deviate from those standards of conduct, we are made to feel guilty. Saturn is many times conditioned guilt, and therefore brings up the whole factor of judgments, because we are not abiding by whatever these standards of right, wrong conduct are. Now, Saturn, Capricorn 10th in its polarity, Moon, Cancer 4th, together have co-rulership of what we would call gender issues, including the hormones, and what we would call childhood and parenting issues as well. Saturn is the authoritarian figure, Moon is the nurturing figure. Those are not gender-based anymore. Saturn is not just the father. You can have a very authoritarian mother in your life. Moon is not just the mother. You can have a very nurturing father in your life. As we are evolving through space-time on planet Earth, expanding in consciousness, we are recognizing that these gender issues are becoming a lot more complex. So therefore you have to do an observation correlation to see which is the nurturing and which is the authoritarian parent in today's world. Saturn will relate to what we call the boundaries of space-time or linear time, how we move through day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year. And Saturn, with this connection to space-time, is how we become informed of mortality issues. Saturn with Jupiter. Jupiter is growth and expansion. Saturn is decay and death. And it's at that first Saturn square that we actually become aware of this issue of death and dying. Usually before that first Saturn square at 7, 8 years old, children don't have a conceptualization of space and time. I have a 4-year-old niece, and we live 5 hours from each other, and anytime we talk on the phone, she's coming to Rapid City. And we see each other sometimes once a month, but usually about every other month. And she's 4 years old, and her mother and her grandmother are teaching her to use a calendar and to mark off the days before she gets her next trip to see Aunt Kimmy. So she's learning that difference between day and night, and she's learning that she's got to go to sleep, and then the next day she gets to mark an X off the calendar, and she gets 1 day closer to coming to see Aunt Kimmy. I think she's going to get this concept of time a little earlier than 7 or 8 because she's learning the calendar at 4 years old. But you get my point here, that Saturn has to do with how we actually move through this conceptualization of time. Oops, hold on just a second here. I've got to keep my slideshow. Whoops. I went too many. Let me just check. Yep. So Saturn is also known as the archetype of self-responsibility. And this is when we really are achieving that maturation process. Because when we grow up and we become an adult, what we are learning is to accept responsibility for everything in our life. That ultimate responsibility, I talk about that with that archetype of Pisces. It's first really accepted here with Saturn Capricorn in the 10th. We're responsible for our actions. We're responsible for our efforts. And we are responsible for the results and the lack of result, for the lack of an effort. Immature Saturn doesn't want to be responsible. It's everybody else's fault. This is a toughie, and this is kind of sometimes almost a letdown. Going into the depression, we'll talk about that here in a couple of points. But again, when we are not accepting responsibility for ourselves, it can be quite a bummer. And because Saturn has to come through that space-time mechanism, it can be a bummer when we recognize that we can make an effort and it doesn't mean each of us get to be president of our country. So Saturn is part of that maturation process with self-responsibility. It's just recognizing the boundaries of where we are in space and time, and that we don't get to skip outside of the structure of our consciousness and what we've come into in this particular lifetime. It can be very sobering to recognize this within ourselves. Saturn Capricorn 10th is the archetype of self-determination. And that is the discipline to take charge of our own life within society. It's also known as a career. And when we look at career, work, job, this is the deeper meaning to our career, our job. That ability to take charge of our life in society. What is our role in society? And within those space-time limitations that Saturn has our soul structured around in the body, in this life, how do we function within that in a mature way? And can we take charge of our own life within our own parameters, rather than, again, blaming it on somebody else? When we really work with that essence of self-determination, then what we are learning about ourselves is a deeper security, an inner security, that Cancer polarity. This is who I am regardless of my career. This is who I am regardless of my position or authority in society. I am more than my position or my career. This is a very beautiful archetype of Saturn to get. This is how we get to some of those goals that we want to have in life. And by the time we get to the element of Earth, Saturn in its rulership of Capricorn 10th house, Capricorn in 10th are the third sign in the element of Earth, Taurus, Virgo, Capricorn triune. By the time we get to that third archetype of Earth, this is where we have all of our resources accumulation and management. This is where we can become CEO of the company. This is where we can create that savings account or portfolio, or, create the resources of a nice house and a nice car, or whatever it is, whatever our particular culture says is the goals we want to achieve with resources. It takes self-responsibility and self-determination to get to those resources accumulation and management. It also takes self-responsibility and self-determination to get to those positions of authority, leadership, being the one in charge. You don't need me to tell you that this can be abused. All we have to look at is Pluto in Saturn's sign Capricorn and see the extremes of haves and have-nots we have taking place on planet Earth right now. So some of the abuses of this archetype with power is the end justifies the means. I'm going to get to this goal at any cost. I don't care who I step over. In a healthy perspective, this archetype will have us looking at power and leadership, where it's not power over, it's shared, it's more communal, and it is supportive. I have a Capricorn rising, and I can remember in my 20s, after my divorce, when it opened me up to astrology and I was studying astrology, my Capricorn rising ran across this cliche. I'm going to paraphrase it. I've forgotten the exact words of it. True leaders lift up those below them, for as those below them rise up, the leader also rises. Very matriarchal principle when it comes to a healthy expression in Capricorn, 10th house, and of course Saturn. Now, when our outer world is not satisfying, whether we've achieved a position of leadership or we don't like something about our job or our role in our family isn't satisfying us, when something about our outer world, Saturn in the structure of consciousness, and consciousness creates matter, when something about that outer world is not to our liking, the principle of involution is activated. And involution is outer compressing or falling in upon itself. Remember, again, Capricorn is that passive polarity, energy moving back to the center. That's involution versus energy moving outward, evolution. And involution, evolution work in tandem with each other, out, in, out, in. And so, with the archetype of Saturn, involution, compression, and depression comes along when our outer reality, our outer circumstances are no longer serving our soul. And it can be something within our soul that we're not comfortable or happy with anymore. And it can be something within our soul that we're trying to cling to and we don't want to let go of. And it's crystallized, that good old word crystallization, with this archetype of Saturn, Capricorn intent. But this is where I have my security built up. This is how I know myself. This is the job I've had for the last 25 years. What do you mean I'm getting a pink slip from the universe? When the outer reality and circumstances are no longer serving us, we're going to be thrown inward upon ourselves. Either we choose it, or it is chosen by the universe for us. When it throws us inward, what it's throwing us to is that polarity archetype, which is the moon, Cancer, and the 4th house. It's throwing us inward to find a deeper level of inner security. And as we do that, then we can come back out into the world and find a new level of outer security. Outer is only as good as inner. And I like to tell people when they have a lot of Saturn, Capricorn, and 10th house archetypes in their charts, when you are trying to push and push and push and do and do and do from that physical work world, and doors are shut, you just can't get it to go forward. It is time to stop and go inward and address it emotionally. Cancer polarity. It is time to feel your way forward rather than trying to act, push your way forward. So these are just, in essence, some of the most pertinent archetypes with Saturn. If anybody has any questions on something I haven't discussed, Leroy, is there anything on the board? Any questions? As I'm waiting.
Not at the present time, though, but I can see you're going to get to this Scorpio part of the puzzle tonight, and that's going to be very interesting.
Thank you. I do give Leroy a printout of all the slides, so that he's not wandering in the dark as he is helping me do these webinars.
Well, of course, I not only that, but I'm somewhat invested, being a natal Saturn and Scorpio, with my Saturn return coming up and Capricorn on the 8th house cusp. So yeah, so I'm on the edge of my seat, actually.
You're getting a few dings, honey. Well, as I was kind of, just looking through notes and prepping myself, I ran across a couple of things. Any of you who are not familiar with this book called Cycles of Becoming by Alexander Ruperti, I think it was published in the 1970s or 80s. It just happened to be one of the first astrology books that I came across. I think I had this before Jeffrey Green even wrote his first Pluto books. It was one of my first early astrology books, and it was a really good reference book. I do appreciate this book very much, and so I recommend this book for you. And I recognized in this class I was not going to be able to go through all of the Saturn cycles. So I will tell you right now, later this year, when there's not so much planetary activity, I'm going to do a class just on the Saturn cycles. And we'll take these 28, 29-year Saturn cycles and their 7-year squares, oppositions, and I'll break them down for everybody. But in the meantime, I do recommend this book. Cycles of the Becoming was republished recently. I'm not going to remember the gentleman who republished it, who recently passed. But I'm going to guess you can still get this book from Amazon. Not many astrology books get a second printing. This one did. And it is still a good resource and reference book, so I recommend it. Now, this Meditations on Saturn by Dane Rudier, I don't think this is a book. If it is, I don't have it, and I've tried to collect all of the Dane Rudier books. Jeffrey Wolf Green, the founder of Evolutionary Astrology, is known for saying that most of his work came to him in dreams. He read very few astrology books, but one of his authors, one of his mentors, was Dane Rudier. And so any of Dane Rudier's books recommended. This link that I have for you is just a short article by Dane Rudier on Saturn, but it is still a real nice reference article, and you can just see the evolution of Jeffrey Green's work from Dane's article to evolutionary astrology and how he looks at it. So again, I just give these to you as more reference materials if you want to study some more on this archetype of Saturn. And so one more time, Leroy, any questions, comments before I move on? And if not, I will move on.
You're clear.
All right. So those of you who are working with me on planetary retrogrades, you're going to know these next 3 slides. And this is specifically from the perspective of evolutionary astrology. Why planetary retrogrades? It is in essence related to this principle of what we call psychological compensation, which is being out of sync with your own true nature, your own true essence of who you essentially are, your liberated individualized self. Psychological compensations will take place anywhere there's dissatisfaction. Remember I told you with my own Saturn natally in the sign of Sagittarius, a structure of consciousness around philosophical belief systems. I've had dissatisfaction. I have Saturn direct. I don't have it retrograde natally. But I would have, you know, just I can remember my whole life. I can remember being a young girl in high school and going, I just want to know the truth. I just want to know the truth. I just want to know the truth. And yet I wouldn't have the power to stand up for the truth. And so I would compensate. And Sagittarius, I'd go quiet. I wouldn't speak up. My Saturn is in the 11th house, the Aquarius house. I also have a structure of consciousness that is based upon unconscious 11th house memories of a lot of persecution, especially religious persecution. Saturn in Sagittarius 11th house. So I have memories of going, if I speak up, I'm going to get hurt. Okay, I want to know the truth, but I don't know if I can talk about it. So we'll compensate and try to appear normal. Younger, I would try to appear that I was happy with status quo religion. And then when my world got thrown apart by a divorce, everything, all the blinders started coming off. And oh, by the way, when that happened, there was, when my first divorce came along in my middle 20s, I shouldn't say first divorce, when my first marriage divorce, because you hear what I'm saying, Roy. When my first marriage ended in a divorce in my middle 20s, Saturn was conjunct Pluto in Libra just before my Scorpio Sun, Mercury, Neptune stellium. That Saturn, that last Saturn Pluto conjunction just tore my reality apart. But anyway, you're getting my point here with this. Status quo. How we are operating in our world today, the status quo. You can see how status quo is almost a Saturnian word. It'll give us strong clues to where we have those compensations for any planetary archetype. And I gave you my example, Saturn, Sag, 11th house. I would compensate on speaking up because I didn't want to get persecuted again. And I went through that Saturn-Pluto transit, and whew, the blinders came off, and during the process of the next few years, I found my voice. I remember getting to the point of the second Saturn square. Past my Saturn return, late 20s, into my first Saturn square in the middle 30s, and I was leading statewide environmental movement with initiatives on the ballot, and I was traveling the state going to all the Lions Club and Kiwanis and all these male clubs, and I was standing up speaking for environmental politics. That's how Saturn can have you break free and looking for new structures in consciousness. And I'm sure there was obviously in that time period a few planetary retrogrades in there that I could research and key in and all that good stuff and how it was happening and taking place for myself. So planetary retrogrades are where we get to break free from these compensations and align ourselves again with who we naturally are. So I was coming back into being the speaker of truth on social causes that I once was, that my soul had compensated on over lifetimes due to the persecutions. Planetary retrogrades are an Earth-centered phenomena. I'll show you in a couple of slides, as you've seen me do before, on how this actually looks from the perspective of planet Earth. Planetary retrogrades are always the more powerful time period for any of those retrograde archetypes, because when the planet is retrograde, it is closer to Earth. It's just vibrationally there and in our face. Retrogrades cause a withdrawal from the status quo to redefine the archetype according to our own natural law. So therefore, that planetary archetype is non-static. It is continually moving, evolving, becoming. It accelerates the evolution of that planet and that's archetype when it's retrograde. And it's going to be defined by the sign and the house that the retrograde is operating through. The planetary retrograde by sign is all of us at the same time collectively, and then it's defined further by each of us having that planetary retrograde in an individual house. We look to the opposite sign and house for clarity, expression, and as always, answers to planetary retrogrades come from within ourselves. If you are born with a natal planet retrograde, these are your individual lessons for an entire lifetime. So as we move forward with Saturn retrograde, then know that anything that we've spoken about in the previous slides, you're trying to throw that off through this entire lifetime. Saturn retrograde natally is someone who has issues with authority, and they're trying to find their own inner authority to then figure out how they're going to come back out and function within society, not outside of it. If you have, when we have that transiting planet retrograde, you see that it's individual and collective planetary lessons all at the same time. And if someone's born with a natal planet retrograde, and that planet's retrograde by transit, they get a temporary harmony and balance. Oh, this is what I'm trying to do. This is what I'm trying to figure out. Leroy and I, another little example for you, we're raising a teenager. Our teenager is 18. The only planet our sun has retrograde is Saturn. And as Saturn has slowed down and went retrograde in tandem with Mars, we've had a few little episodes with our teenager not wanting to work with those in positions of authority, i.e. teachers and grades. And he is 3 months from graduating and in danger of graduating, and rock has hit the fan. So as Saturn's went retrograde and he has it natally, it is our intent that he's going to get it. Oh, I do have to be my own authority, but I still got to function in the world. And of course, anytime somebody's born with a planet, remember we said Saturn has 5 days of being stationary or appearing to stop and stand still when it's turning retrograde or direct? Anytime you're born during one of those 5-day time periods, it's pretty intensified. If it's retrograde, you have lifetimes of Saturn issues that you have been conforming, compensating with, that you've got to throw off. And if it's direct, you got to step up to the plate and take charge of your life. Interesting little side note with our teenager. Our teenager has the Saturn retrograde in the 4th house, opposite house of Saturn's rulership, and it's pointing towards the 10th, which means there's a rebellion against authority, but there's a need to learn how to mature 4th to 10th and learn how to function in the world with as your own authority, but within other authorities. Now, again, here's the visual of what this looks like when it's an outer planet. And by the way, Sun is right in the middle of the circle with Earth and the outer planet. And so what you have happening, because the Earth's revolution is inside that outer planet, in reality, the Earth is moving faster and it moves ahead. But what it appears like, looking at that planet through the backdrop of the stars, which is those numbers out there against the backdrop of the stars, that planet, as you see, tends to make a loop in the sky. Stops, retrogrades, stops, goes forward again. So just one more reminder now from that slide I gave you at the beginning with more of the aspects for Saturn, Sun-Saturn. Just another reminder, okay? This is the Saturn retrogrades we're dealing with. Here's its shadow time periods. Here's its opposition to the Sun, which is the high point, the highlights of getting what this retrograde cycle is all about. And here is that annual cycle you can see right now from November 2013 to November 2014. That's the annual cycle that Saturn is in the process with in regards to the Sun. So for any of you who have, as you're looking at these degrees with Scorpio, any of you who have fixed planets, that's going to be Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, Aquarius. Any of you who have fixed planets close to these degrees, as you can see, we're going from 14 to 25 over this calendar year. This retrograde is going to be more intense for you. Our teenager, and I didn't get a chart, so if we have enough time and I need to put up a chart, I'll put my teenagers up. Our teenager ascended is 21 degrees Scorpio. So he's having Saturn come over the ascendant for the first time, 2 degrees past his ascendant, and boom, retrograde. And he's having this reality check with grades and teachers and parents as authority figures. And he's going to go back into his 12th. We hope by the time Saturn goes direct and it gets to 23 degrees again this fall, we'll see whether or not he's in college, working a job. Who knows? Stay tuned. So again, you can look at this for your own chart and just look at where do you have those fixed degrees. I happen to have Moon at 2338 Scorpio in the 10th house. So Saturn is going retrograde minutes before my Moon, and I have all the webinar responsibility that I am expanding and moving forward with this year. And I'm doing some, I find myself starting to experiment with my webinars now, going, how should I do this? How should I do that? And I have creative ideas coming through, and I have to do the Saturnian space-time thing about how I'm going to do them. So stay tuned to my webinars this August when Saturn has moved to 23 Scorpio, and it goes over my Moon just a few days after my birthday is the end of this year. So here's those dates for you, okay? So, Saturn retrograde, of course, any planetary retrograde cycle is always related back to that natal planet by sign, house, and aspect. So as you're looking in your own chart at Saturn in Scorpio, and where it's turning retrograde in a certain house of your chart, all of these issues we're going to be speaking about will still relate back to your natal Saturn signature. There's going to be a Saturn retrograde theme of throwing off conditioning patterns. Saturn retrograde throwing off the past, throwing off the crystallizations, throwing off environmental conditionings. And Saturn retrograde is known for throwing open the door to the unconsciousness or the outer planets that circulate beyond Saturn. And so I just put them down there briefly for you. Chiron, that interface between the consciousness, unconsciousness on an individual level, Saturn, individuated unconsciousness, Neptune, collective conscious unconsciousness, and of course Pluto, the soul, individually and collectively. So Saturn retrograde, even though it can be harsh for us on the reality checks and the realities in our world that are not moving forward, are not functioning, are collapsing in upon itself, even though it looks like Saturn retrograde is just breaking everything down, it's not bad. It's really throwing open all of the insights from deeper levels. And so those 4 months that Saturn's retrograde, we want to be listening to what's coming up into the consciousness for ourselves on very subtle levels. Uranus is in Aries. He won't have any problem telling us what's coming forward, what's coming, what's coming, what's coming, what's coming, in that repetitive way that Uranus will pop things up to the surface. I'll look at Saturn and its relationships to these 4 outer planets here towards the end of the slideshow for you. I want to take a drink, and I'm going to move into Saturn retrograde in Scorpio. And here's where I'm trying something new with planetary retrogrades. And so you can let me know how this works for you and give me some feedback via emails or Facebook or whatever. I'm noticing that when I go through a planetary archetype in a sign, and then I look at it retrograde, I'm talking about the same thing twice. Go ahead, Leroy.
Oh, I just wanted to kind of talk about briefly, my little Saturn retrograde experience in terms of disseminating this information. You referred to it in the last forecasting webinar, but essentially, I using it as a reminder for everybody out there. We've done many of these forecasting webinars now, and just the aha of being able to distribute the MP3 file and the video link within the PDF document itself, and then being able to get that PDF document right after purchasing one of these forecasting webinars on the website is just a minor little thing for me, but it was a big aha in terms of, having done things for the same way for so long and trying to figure it out again. I needed the Saturn retro to get the aha. So, there's many revelations to discover during Saturn retrograde periods. I guess that was mine as it pertains to work.
Leroy has Saturn in the 6th house of all the details. He has Saturn in Scorpio 6th natal moon. So yeah, that getting in that pattern of working with all of the day-by-day work details, and then returning retrograde and poof, throwing it off and finding an easier way.
Make it easier for me and for everybody else, to get the information essentially.
So again, I'm going to look at the archetype of Saturn in Scorpio, and at the same time we're going to be discussing it retrograde, because it's going to be relating to same archetypes. Well, one of the things that happens when Saturn is in Scorpio and it turns retrograde, all of our deepest emotional fears are thrown up to the surface. Scorpio, I've got to have control. I've got to feel secure. both Saturn and the archetype of Scorpio want to have security. And so Saturn retrograde is throwing all the old emotional patterns into the air. And so all the emotional fears and vulnerabilities are going to get exposed. And you just look to what house you have that Saturn transiting through. And then that's going to tell you to the polarity point, Taurus opposite of Scorpio, where you need to reach for deeper levels of self-reliance. And we're going to reach that self-reliance by having a realignment with a greater source of power, Scorpio. Scorpio is where we're dealing with the returning and separating forces of power. On the ultimate level, Scorpio trine Pisces, source energy itself. And so as we have, again, our emotional fears, vulnerabilities, betrayals, whatever thrown up, we are looking to merge with whatever we perceive to be more powerful, looking for a sense of security. And then when we do that, what we need to do is go over that Taurus polarity and find deeper self-reliance. It's like the Saturn retrograde in Scorpio answers are Cancer and Taurus. Cancer opposite Capricorn, Saturn's ruler. Taurus opposite Scorpio. So we got to find physical self-reliance, Taurus. We have to find emotional self-reliance at Cancer polarity by archetype. So this is going to be the big theme. And I hear you. Go ahead, Leroy.
Well, the root of all the fears, I guess is the question I'm asking myself. And basically, I think we can all agree, probably having many Scorpio Saturns on this call, that, it's rooted in all those intense emotions. There can be such a deepening or over concentration of those emotions in this sign of Scorpio that there could be actually a blockage. So many complex and opposed emotions are at work because of the blockage. So then people can be accused of maybe being a little secretive or jealous, maybe have a power complex with people at work, because of all of those deep emotions that are running just below the surface.
You see, I put two little examples down there on a collective level. You're looking at Putin and all that crap he got about the Olympics. And what happens? I'm sure he not only had some fears, which who knows if he could even recognize something like that. For him, it was probably running the surface as anger, and so we're just caught up in the news with the whole issue around what's happening in Ukraine and Crimea or whatever it is, and he's doing a power over. He's doing a power grab and trying to prove his power and might, Saturn Scorpio in the world. A little more progressive way with the returning forces is seeing the progression of the gender rights issues in places like the United States. Now you can look at places in Africa and that gender rights regressions goes over to the separating side. So just a couple of collective examples for you there.
From Putin's perspective.
So moving on.
Can I just add something to that, Kim? Daniel, in fact, had made a comment about the historical necessity of this power grab going on in the Ukraine or Crimea. And it's really because in his reality, it's necessary because, as Daniel reminded us, it's the only, year-round open port that's available for, the ships and especially the warships, et cetera, and the oil ships to come and go out of the Black Sea. So, from his perspective, it's a very Saturnian necessity. It's real. You've got
Saturn in Scorpio. Oh, thank you, Daniel. I didn't know that detail. I didn't know it was Russia's only port. Ooh, that puts it, that now we understand what's going on
Yeah,
a little bit
strategic.
deeper perspective of Putin.
It's the only one that doesn't freeze
Mm-hmm.
over. Let's put it that way.
Okay, got it. Gotcha. Okay, so moving ahead a little bit and moving on. So, Saturn in Scorpio is going to be the structure of consciousness around our emotions. And Saturn relates to that maturation process. And so during Saturn's transit through Scorpio, we all are going to have to, with or without the retrograde, face where we have emotional immaturity and emotional restrictions. And we're going to have to go through an emotional maturation process with that. Now, we can see on one level, if we're on the codependent or neediness side of Scorpio, then Saturn in Scorpio is going to exacerbate the control issues, the jealousy and possessiveness that Leroy was mentioning a moment ago. And it can go retrograde, and those things are just going to go to, extremes if we're not reaching over to that Taurian self-reliance. Now, the opposite of neediness, though, with Scorpio is isolation. Scorpio can go, it's too scary to give my power away in a commitment to someone. So I'm just going to draw the boundaries. I'm not going to let anybody in. Saturn and Scorpio, I can hold the walls up as good as anybody. And what's underneath that is, either previous or past life fears of loss, betrayal, and abandonment. And what can typically happen for an individual who gets on that isolation side of the bandwagon, they can repeat. They can isolate themselves all they want. But there is a purpose to Scorpio having to walk through that loss, betrayal, abandonment. It is to wake them up. It is to help them go over to that Taurian self-reliance and find the self-love deep enough that, again, they can learn how to commit through the risk. Scorpio, insecure Scorpio, wants to have all the power and all the control in order to feel secure. So all the security buttons are just going to be maxed out with Saturn and Scorpio. And then they get activated through the retrograde process in an effort to bring them into consciousness and solve the insecurity that's underneath it. So that Scorpio psychological detective, there needs to be a deepening of the psychological understanding on emotional levels versus Saturn trying to suppress it. So Saturn, during its 2.5-year cycle through Scorpio, if we're going around, again, for all of us to have it in some degree, where there might be some degree of emotional suppression or control. When Saturn turns retrograde, it's going to come to the surface. There's going to be no more denying it. So we need to ask those deep psychological questions. Why? And with Scorpio, if we just ask why, it raises up the energy to bring information, deeper understandings to us. And so Scorpio is where we deal with those issues of power versus powerless. That archetype of Scorpio relates to Pluto and the 8th house. And together that is the soul. And the soul has that dual desire nature, separate from source, return to source. And so this archetype of Scorpio is where we learn there are greater forces in the power than us, greater forces of power in the universe than us. It's not only separating desires, it's separating forces, returning forces. So we're always going to run up against the limitations of our own power. Feel that powerlessness, and then reach for or understand that there's a greater power out there. And Scorpio wants to do that osmosis merging with it, to osmosis incorporate, become more than what it was before, to become that greater power. And this will happen from a separating and returning nature. And so Saturn in Scorpio, we just become so hyper attuned to this power versus powerlessness. And Saturn in Scorpio is just going to be going out there reaching for that power. And is it going to be separating forces? The undermining of the separating forces, which in its extreme, we can know from that archetype of Lucifer, you know, it's the separating forces in the universe trying to undermine us. Or are we going to try to merge with the returning forces, source energy itself? And if we're reaching for it in that level, if we're working with the separating forces, we want it more from a materialistic perspective or power over another person perspective. If we're working with it from the returning forces energy, source energy, then we're going to be working to reach our next level of self-reliance within ourselves.
So, Kim, on a parallel note then, a question on the board came up. How do you find the forgiveness not to need to get even with the Scorpio
That's
energy?
a good one. Oh, good. That's a good point. That's a very good point, because what happens with that Scorpio energy from the perspective of reincarnation is we can literally have someone who has been hurtful to us in a past life, and it gets caught up in this revolving door lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. And we'll get to the current lifetime, and we can actually be a literal victim of somebody hurting us. And we have every right within us to get angry, to want to hurt them, to want to go after them again. And all it is going to do is perpetuate that cycle of karma, back and forth and back and forth, or revenge. And so reaching over to that Taurus polarity is reaching to that next level of self-reliance and stepping off the bandwagon of revenge. And it is so much easier said than done. Now, that doesn't mean that you let someone in the current life physically harm you and you want to defend yourself. But say there's been some emotional betrayal, or, you know, all kinds of examples in regards to this that can be non-physical examples, emotional, mental, spiritual. It does take the utmost of energy to step back and objectify and go, okay, I can go for this, but will I be happy afterwards? I guess that's one of the ways that I look at it. I've spoken about this before, and I don't remember what context, but when I'm looking at a very scorpionic situation with someone, I'm always in process. I always ask that question, how do I minimize the karma? How do I minimize the karma? You know, and I've had intense anger come up at the laziness of my teenager, and anger where I just want to hit him and shake him. And I'm going, oh, that really works, Kim, doesn't it? You know better. You can have that feeling towards your teenager, Kim Marie. But that doesn't mean you're going to act upon that feeling. And so off to the gym I go, working my way through that energy and trying to get back to that center of self-reliance where I can address it civilly, where I can kind of have a little bit of detachment from the intensity of power struggles that come up with raising a teenager. So when it comes to that Scorpio cycle of revenge, it is a very personal, intuitive choice point as to what is the next step to break the karmic cycle together. It's not a black and white choice. The beauty of Saturn retrograde in Scorpio, throwing open the doors from the unconsciousness, is you can ask the famous why question. You can meditate on deeper things. You can get deeper past life patterning coming to the surface, which gives you greater Saturnian freedom, Saturn retrograde, to not be stuck in those old crystallized patterns and the old same behaviors that have been going on again and again and again and again. Make sense, Mimi? You can just be silent if you don't want to unmute, Leroy, and you're getting pretty good. You interrupt me when you need to. So there's choice points with Saturn retrograde in Scorpio of whether we're going to merge with separating energies or returning energies. And I always ask, how do I minimize the karma? How do I minimize the karma? What's the healthiest actions for all choices involved? Or no, what's the healthiest choices of action for all parties involved? What is the healthiest choices of action for all parties involved? Of course, Saturn in Scorpio and its retrograde cycle is going to be working through relationship issues, especially of an intimate level, one-on-one, whether heterosexual or homosexual or any of the all above. But what we need to really look at is the fact that relationship patterns need a metamorphosis. They need a change. They are going to have become crystallized in some way for security reasons. And so when we get stuck in that same old pattern again and again and again to feel secure, it limits growth. What is one of the most common ways that we do it through religious imprinting? Till death us do part.
Ouch for the Scorpio.
Oh.
But that does reveal, the core paradox here, doesn't it? Because, we all want to blend with another, yet blending our life with another can be the biggest fear with this placement. Saturn and Scorpio, it can bring up all those complex, deep-seated emotions, and yet on the other side of this scale, you really long for that. You long to merge. It's the urge to merge, and yet we're afraid we're going to get hurt. No wonder we have, you can have all sorts of blockage of energy and stops and starts with sexuality here. It could just be a lot in the mix, to say the least.
Oh yes, that's definitely it. Again, Saturn retrograde in Scorpio will bring up confrontation. Scorpio, fixed emotional energy. Saturn's just going to intensify it with its conditioning factors. It's going to bring up necessary confrontations, however it needs to come about. And for each person in that relationship, they need to go to their next level of self-reliance. They need to go inward and self-love and, self-understand and self-relate. Because that gets them in greater touch with themselves. It gets them in touch with where they have those Scorpio fears. And then it allows them to go through, move forward, whatever changes are necessary in the relationship patterns. Saturn retrograde in Scorpio doesn't mean any and all relationships are doomed to end, but it does mean the crystallization of old patterns need to be addressed, need to be made conscious, need to be let go of, need to be renegotiated, changed, metamorphosed. What we can have happening during this time period for so many is that it can blow up and that's it, I'm out of here. And I'm gone. And sometimes when that type of patterning is going on, if we have somebody who's, just blowing up and adios, I'm out of here, there is an extreme emotional vulnerability under the surface, and they don't want to address it. And so being able to look at your own emotional situation becomes very important to do. Are you trying to project that blame onto the other person? Are you really asking what your own fears are? What is it within yourself that needs to change in regards to all of this? I have another slide that will go tandem with some of this stuff that we're speaking about right here. But Saturn in Scorpio, if we're not self-reliant and we are overly invested in security through another, Scorpio then can commit to someone for the duration of the time that their needs are met. And when those codependency needs are not being met, that Scorpio energy can go out there looking for it elsewhere. The famous betrayals of trust, the famous emotional betrayals. So the love affairs can be going on. And what happens with Scorpio and those hypnotic attractions? We talked about this for those of you who are on the Mars retrograde and Libra class, which I think was last week. Attraction outside primary relationship is just a mechanism to tell us what's missing in primary relationship. So minimizing karma is about taking the outside attraction pattern and trying to work it in the primary relationship. And if we make that effort and it doesn't work, or the partner's unable or unwilling, then we're more karmically free to move on. But to have that honesty factor is so important. So here's Mars turning retrograde, and you can refer back to that webinar if you want. March 1st, Mars retrograde, Saturn retrograde, March 2nd. There's so much intensity that's built up with relationship patterns that are just busting out all over the place. And again, we've got to go back to be ourselves and finding our self-reliance to then really know how we are meant to move forward. Scorpio can be so codependent. And when that codependency, or the external dependency on another, becomes too strong, we're going to have someone, betray us to force us back in upon ourselves. That's how my first marriage broke up. I was a very codependent young little Scorpio with an 8th house Pluto. And my ex left me for my best friend. I've been through this stuff that we're talking about right here. but I opened the door for me to find astrology, and I hope my ex is as happy as I am. So it comes up when there's an over codependency. It comes up when we're not working through our insecurities. Now, I said relationship commitments and endings here. It's not just all about endings. There's someone through Saturn in Scorpio, Saturn in Libra, and Saturn in Scorpio, someone's really been working upon their own self-reliance, their own maturation process. Saturn in Scorpio can be an excellent time period for a wedding, for relationship commitments. So it's not all one way or another. And I'm going to go on to the next slide, but I hear Leroy breathing, so I know to take a little note, and I'll come back and forth as I need to.
I did mean to breathe through you. Yeah, we're too close. We're too enmeshed here on the call, I'm afraid, Kim. But
our headsets are too good.
But what you were talking about is you're started to bridge to solutions, and I think it'd be worthy to observe as I'm interacting with a lot of students on this call, and many of the themes of people on this call drawn to Pluto astrology of all things. You know, with this placement or a lot of Scorpio in the chart, you know, it's easy to see why people become students of EA, because you want to explore these dark realms of the psyche in order to get over some of these relationship betrayals that we've all had, and you know, your personal story as well, and because you want to learn to master and then bring into the consciousness all these hidden drives within you. And when you do that, when you master these things, then you can transform the energy into healing power for yourself and your partner and those around you.
So slide back here, and all these relationship patterns that need to change, and all the relationship upsets that are coming along, they're all going to be related to trust issues. And trust issues will be found. The ability to trust yourself is found through that Taurian polarity. The polarity of Scorpio is Taurus. So we've got to go back to finding trust within ourselves, trust with our relationship to source energy, trust in our relationship with the world. And then we can evolve or metamorphose those issues around trust. The Scorpio codependency side, where we don't have trust within ourselves or we don't trust others, then that just increases the control issues, the jealousy, the possessiveness, all those scorpionic games that get played. When we reach for that Taurian self-reliance, then we have that inner sense of well-being, and we trust our intuition, and we learn to trust our ability to have discernment in all of these relationship issues. Now, something about Scorpio is it's a square to Leo and Aquarius. And Leo and Aquarius are loosely, you want to look at it from intimacy issues, lovers and friends. Leo lovers, Aquarian friends. And healthy relationship endings is where lovers turn back into friends. And so when we work with, again, what we're working with is that fixed modality here. Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, Aquarius. When we work with that Taurian self-reliance, we know who to trust and who not to trust. The Scorpio hairs stand up on the back of our neck when we're around the snakes. And so we trust that inner guidance system. We trust the gut. We trust the intuition. And Scorpio is very, very sharp on this issue when it's self-reliant. Scorpio is sharp on that issue when it's codependent. But when Scorpio doesn't have the self-trust and it's really out there into that codependency and security is outside of myself with someone else, then we override that intuition. And then we still end up with the betrayal, abandonment, etc. We're still throwing in on ourselves. So there's a lesson with this Saturn retrograde cycle of really working on the Taurus archetype so that then we can have that intuitive discernment. Yes, no, change here, change there in any of our intimate relationships. Another thing that we have to work through with the Saturn in Scorpio and its retrograde cycles there is the whole dual desire nature, separating, returning desires, facing the reality of our individual soul's life. I touched upon this a little earlier with the Saturn archetype. Saturn being that structure, the individuated consciousness, and how it condenses into the individual soul and the form of this soul in a body, and what family and culture and religion and resource conditionings it comes into. You know, we all don't get to be CEOs of corporations and country presidents and, you know, stars winning Academy Awards. What is the reality of the world that I am functioning in? What are the parameters, the limitations within my soul? And from the broader perspective of reincarnation and as many lifetimes as we need to exhaust the separating desires and return to source, there are no victims, there are no limitations. But in the context of a life to a life to a life, in the context of individual lifetimes, there's only so much we can achieve in a single life. And so Saturn in Scorpio is looking at that desire nature, and when it turns retrograde, it's throwing off the desires that no longer serve our soul and asking what does serve my soul. And then it's getting real with what we can actually achieve and do and be and create in a single lifetime, and making peace with what we cannot. You know, a little joke between Leroy and I is that, you know, I have memory of my most recent lifetime, and I was female, and I was in Nazi Germany, and I went to the gas chamber with 3 small children. And in this lifetime, I've always had fear of being pregnant and fear of having children. And if anybody knows me, I have a nickname that's called Mama Kim. And children and pets and everything just gravitate towards me for the most part, except for my karma with my kid. Anyway, I have stated to Leroy, I says, I know I'm not done. I know I have desire within me to have a successful relationship as a parent in a future life. Reality is, I didn't have a kid this lifetime, and I went through menopause. I'm not going to have a kid this lifetime. So facing those parameters of what is achievable or real for us and what is not, and making peace with it. And I made peace with not having children this lifetime before menopause, and am perfectly fine with it. There's there's all kinds of children to love and nurture in this world, in addition to your own bio children. But you're seeing these parameters with my examples of Saturn. And Saturn in Scorpio is going to get frustrated because it doesn't like limitation. It wants the power. And so that Saturn retrograde in Scorpio is an opportunity to make peace with the anger and accepting the parameters of who we are not, what we can do, and what we cannot do in this particular life. And of course, just on that separating versus returning desires, you know, this is where it all comes up in the air for us, okay? What are the old desires, the old desire patterns no longer serving us that it's time to release, let it go. You know, I did it before this particular Saturn retrograde, recognizing that, you know, I want to have a child. It was a love-hate, so I've let that go. But I've recognized that I still have that separating desire in a future life. That is still something that's going to be that karmic pull, Saturnian pull back to a physical body again. All right, I'm looking at the time here. Moving on. Of course, this is going to bring up gender issues. Just by nature of the fact that Saturn is part of the cardinal cross, and Saturn in Cancer work with gender and hormonal issues. And so those are going to seem to go to extremes with Saturn in Scorpio. And they'll come up to the surface with the retrograde. And so you can just look here in the United States, and you can see all of the legal issues we have on gender equality rights, from one extreme to the other, to where there is progression of gender rights, where court cases are supportive of them just like they are civil rights, and gender rights similar to male-female rights. Okay, those still have a ways to go. Women and men doing the same job and getting paid equally at that. But we can also see where there's the extremes of, you know, Arizona got in the news about, you know, trying to pass a law. The legislature actually passed a law, and the governor vetoed it, in regards that any business that did not want to service gays, and a lot of this is coming around the whole wedding area, you know, flowers and wedding cakes and churches and, you know, that whole industry, that trying to pass a law that they didn't have to serve gays, and the governor vetoed it. Well, it didn't make the news, but our South Dakota, a little on the redneck side, had the same law going through the legislature. Luckily for us, it was killed in committee. It never got to the governor signing it. Our governor probably would have signed it. So all of those things are going to come up. And from a parental, offspring, children, partner point of view, what if you're married to someone for 10, 15 years, and Saturn in Scorpio, they tell you they want to do a gender change? I think I'm gay. Husband tells wife, I've fallen in love with another man, and vice versa. These things are coming through with Saturn in Scorpio just as much. Now, there can be a tendency, Saturn in Scorpio, to try and have a suppression of this kind of energy. The retrograde will bring it up to the surface. For those who are facing the gender limitations and choices, and so whether it is an attendee on the call or a practicing astrologer dealing with clients, you can have someone coming to you and saying, I think I want to go through hormones and have surgery and switch genders. There can be a natural revelation of this during Saturn in Scorpio. I don't, as an astrologer, see that it's a choice to make for them. What we can know is that with this vibrational archetype, Saturn in Scorpio, we can be encouraging of them to explore it. If it is something that they have been exploring for decades, this might be the time to act. If it is something that's just coming up, they might want to continue to explore it through Saturn in Scorpio and see if they want to still act on it once Saturn goes into Sagittarius. And so these are also some of the relationship changes and issues that people can be experiencing or pondering through this particular Saturn retrograde in Scorpio. Remember Saturn and self-responsibility? Well, put it in Scorpio. We don't want to be responsible. It's their fault. It's the teacher's fault, my parents' fault, my partner's fault, my boss's fault. It's the co-workers. It's going to be somebody else other than me. And so we can have codependencies exposed outside of intimate relationships. And again, that's going to point us towards Taurus. We can have control games to try and have an appearance of responsibility versus real self-reliance. Taking this outside of relationships on an intimate level. We can have situations with friends, the square to Aquarius, with co-workers, where there's upsets that come along. Friendships can be just as codependent as intimate partners can be. Family members can be just as codependent as intimate relationships. So partners leaving, left with yourself, replace family members leaving, parents leaving, children leaving, and we're left with ourselves. Part of that self-responsibility is if you are choosing to end the relationship, is being a mature adult about it versus playing some blame game rather than recognizing it's coming from within you. So choosing to leave the worn out partner, replace partner with friend, with family member, with whatever. The theme is self-responsibility versus blaming another, and the variables can be endless. And then, of course, when it comes to career and job and finances and economic choice points, which is doubly emphasized with Saturn and Pluto in each other's signs. We'll have power grabs, we'll have falls from grace. Anybody notice how sex trafficking is in the news for those of you who watch the news? It's really been in the news the last few weeks. There's Saturn in Scorpio moving into the retrograde and bringing that into visibility. There was an article in our local state, South Dakota, and it's like the number of arrests and sex trafficking has increased, let's say, 400% in the last 3 years. It has been in the news since Saturn went into Scorpio, October of 2012, and it's been increasing in awareness with the public. Of course, when we come to the career and job choices, there's all the power versus powerlessness. You know, the mean boss, the sexual innuendos from the boss. And we can have all the downsizing. We can still have that going on with Saturn and Scorpio. We can have someone choose to leave and become an entrepreneur. that has been very strong since the economic downturn. Pluto in Capricorn 2008, and now Saturn in Scorpio. There's a lot of entrepreneurialism that is really going on all over the place right now. So this stuff isn't all bad. Saturn can go retrograde and it can go, enough. I've had this creative idea. I've been working on it as a hobby, and it's now time to just go forward with it. The retrograde can be setting us free in regards to some of the career choices. It's not always having it wiped out from underneath us. It can be making the choice to liberate ourselves. Saturn retrograde, Scorpio. I've got a few more slides. I'm going to have to do these fast for you. I want you to remember that you're going to get a PDF of this so you can look at these slides to get all your notes down as you want to. Before I move on, Leroy, with the rest of my slides, I need to stop for a moment. Questions, comments?
Nope, we're good, but there is one Saturn comment I want to make about the PDF. Just know out there that when you start getting these MP3 links and video links in the PDF, if you click on them and they don't go right away to the page on YouTube or to the MP3 files, of course, to download, just copy and paste that link into a new internet web browser window, and it will work. Okay, that's one. We've had some feedback from students that. I clicked on it, it didn't work. Well, just copy and paste the link into a new internet browser and it will work. Thank you, Kim.
Good. Here's health and wellness. And again, this is going to be a little fast. Saturn, with that structure of consciousness as it condenses into the body. Saturn rules the skin, co-rulership of the skin with Uranus. Skeleton, vertebrae, spine, spinal disc, spinal cord, bones. Saturn has knees when you go Aries to Pisces, head to toe. Saturn's the teeth. Some of the Saturn issues can be osteoporosis, arthritis, again, that decay and death. The B and T cells, which support the immune system, come from the bone marrow. Saturn, bones. Co-ruler with Jupiter, pituitary, thyroid, prostate. Those issues can come up generically when Saturn's retrograde in any sign. Saturn is issues of wherever anything is crystallized, frozen, paralyzed within the body. Saturn can be depression and exhaustion. Saturn has specific rulership, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus. In the chakra system, Saturn is the outer layer of the root chakra. So it brings in the anus, anal canal, hemorrhoids, feces, and Saturn's always trying to clamp down the root chakra versus opening it up. So Saturn retrograde, those issues can come up. Again, you'll have the slideshow to get this down more. Saturn in Scorpio, disease or dysfunctions of the pancreas, liver, colon, intestine, cancer polarity, stomach, and duodenum. Well, how do you pronounce that? And of course, as you're looking at this, these are a lot of the Scorpio issues. The cervical, uterine, ovarian issues, genetic birth defects, disease or dysfunctions of the endocrine or lymphatic systems, enzymes or Pluto, Scorpio, cancers or Pluto, Scorpio. And of course, we're repeating that spinal column vertebra thing again. So these types of issues can be coming to the surface. Saturn retrograde in Scorpio. Continuing on, just working with, this was from the Mars retrograde one. Mars is waning semi-sextiles to Saturn. Going to have a conjunction, Mars-Saturn 2-year cycle. Surrendering to our deepest relationship lessons and that serenity prayer. Again, what can I change and what can I not change, and how do I make peace with it? Waning semi-sextile, Libra, Scorpio. Releasing all the God-Goddess projections, expecting our partners to be ideal and then disappointed when they're humans. Recognizing relationship endings, deepening relationship with universal source. Jupiter. As I go through these outer planets, I put the conjunctions in. Jupiter-Saturn is a 20-year cycle. And so what we have going on through this Saturn retrograde is going to be the last of the waning trines with Jupiter in Cancer. Very succinct. Waning trine. Ease of change, ease of resistance. So we're looking at emotional codependency or emotional self-reliance. What's your choice? And all of you are going to be making those individual choices. Saturn Chiron's a little more active. This is where Saturn is the most active in this retrograde cycle. Look at the bottom. The Saturn Chiron cycle varies widely from 63 to 84 years. They're close together. And Chiron is in 4 signs of the zodiac. Chiron is in 1/3 of the zodiac. Aquarius, Pisces, Aries, Taurus. 30 out of its 51 years. So it just so happened this particular Saturn Chiron cycle, there were 27 Saturn Chiron oppositions between 1986 and 2006, from 9 degrees Sag to 9 degrees Leo. What we really have going on, though, is 5 Saturn waning trines to Chiron, Scorpio, Pisces. And we have 2 of them left, one during the midst of this retrograde cycle. What we are looking at here is a re-imprinting of a sense of victimization and powerlessness, or making an effort to stand for justice and mutual power. Now, this is from both an individual or collective level. Are we a victim in our relationship if we're in one and the partner has all the power? Are we trying to have all the power over the partner? Or are both of us making an effort to have more equality in our intimate relationship? And collectively, all you got to do again, look at what's happening in the world all over the place. The haves and the have-nots are battling it out. And as a matter of fact, Saturn is making waning aspects, or it's in the waning half of the cycle to the 4 outer planets as we finish up through this. Saturn's waning Uranus. It doesn't have any specific aspects in this particular Saturn retrograde, but you can see 2013 waning inconjuncts. Next year, waning sesquisquadrates. And so briefly, Saturn-Uranus, reality is in conflict with technology and revolution. Old reality, Saturn, Scorpio, Pluto, Capricorn, haves and have-nots, and look at the revolutions taking place on the planet. Look at the technological explosions that are fueling a lot of these revolutions. Like Saturn and Scorpio doesn't get to have secrets anymore. Uranus and Aries is just going to put them out there. So if you don't want it exposed, make a choice not to put it in your reality. Saturn waning Neptune. Again, no specific aspects, although we're moving from waning trines to waning squares between Saturn and Neptune. And so reality is in conflict with the beliefs. Why does my world not work with the ideals of how I thought it should? So we go through the inner reflections that have us evolving our beliefs and either making peace with reality as it is, or letting these old realities that are no longer serving our soul go, individually and collectively. Saturn waning Pluto, same thing. No exact aspects, but we're moving from the waning sextiles to the waning semi-squares between them. This is the mutual reception. These two are so strong. All the patterns are emphasized and they're falling apart. Reality in conflict with power. And again, individually and collectively. And so where do you go to the Taurian self-reliance, polarity Scorpio? Where do you go to the Cancerian emotional self-reliance from the Pluto Cap polarity? How do you deepen your inner sense of self to then participate as a citizen in planet Earth? Within your world, your family, your community, from the most personal broadening out as far as you can take it. This is a strong one. Do not think that just because Saturn and Pluto don't have aspects this year, they don't have any impact. All relating patterns are coming to a head, personal to collective, power grabs versus self-reliance and cooperation. We've looked at this in a little bit of detail throughout the last 2 hours. Many career and economic patterns, especially on collective cycles, coming to a head. Haves versus have-nots. Again, power grabs versus mutual win-wins. And any of you who've taken classes from me know that I am a big fan of Ellen Brown. And I'll speak in detail to the class that's about the Cardinal Grand Cross coming up in early April. But this is still happening for all of us on a very individual level. Where do you feel powerless in your life? Where are you having to reach for greater inner empowerment? And then how are you choosing to come back out with family, with partners, co-workers, bosses, the world, everything else, and interact in new ways? Saturn and the outer planets. Look ahead at this one. I couldn't resist putting these last few slides in. Look at the conjunction, Saturn in its waning cycles to the 4 outer planets, 2020, 2026, 2028, 2032. Saturn's conjunctions to then move forward. You can just look at that and say, oh my gosh, the rest of this decade, there's so many old reality structures that are going to be crumbling. Scorpio, it's going to be all about relationships. Sag, beliefs. Aquarius, societal, or then, excuse me, Capricorn. We're still going to, that haves versus have-nots. Who has the power and who doesn't? That's going to continue to just be in the news, in the air. And then, add on Jupiter. Jupiter is in its waning half of its cycle to Saturn. So Saturn has 5 planetary conjunctions coming up through the next decade. That alone, again, is just telling you that you want to surrender, Saturn. You want to be opening up. Saturn, what are my new realities that are coming through? How is my world being asked to change? So one more time, Saturn is facing some of those greatest emotional fears and reaching for deeper levels of self-alignment, realigning with a greater source of power of a separating or returning nature. So you can just ask yourself, where do you fear betrayals? Where do you have anger over power issues? Where is your next level of self-reliance? And how are you more than your position out in the world? I always think my material is never going to last 2 hours, and then I'm always struggling to get it done in 2 hours. Any comments or questions, Leroy?
No, Kim, we're pretty clear. Just some thanks on the board and gratitude for the work you put in. So appreciation would be a comment.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you all make the most of this Saturn retrograde in Scorpio and reach some beautiful levels of self-empowerment. Here's the future classes. There isn't a public class until the beginning of April, when we'll have 2. I probably will separate out the Neptune Chiron retrogrades. As I'm getting my webinar curve down, I'm recognizing I'm not going to be able to cover both those planets in one time, and especially because Chiron cycle is so fascinating. So I'll probably break those 2 out, but here are the remaining classes. Look for future emails from us on those. And so if there's not any more comments or questions, I thank you all very, very much for participating in this new way of public classes with Leroy and I, our webinars.